The courthouse steps were slippery from the morning rain, but that wasn't why Natasha Wilson stumbled. Her legs gave out beneath her like they'd been doing for months now, and this time there was no hiding it. The divorce papers scattered across the wet concrete as she fell to her knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Natasha, what are you doing? Get up," James Wilson snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. He stood 3 feet away, his expensive suit untouched by the rain that soaked through her thin jacket. "We're already running late and I have a meeting at 2. She tried to speak, tried to tell him she couldn't breathe, but the words came out as a wheeze. Her chest felt like someone had wrapped steel bands around her ribs and kept tightening them. The world started to blur at the edges, and she pressed her palm against the cold stone step, trying to anchor herself to consciousness. I can't," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of traffic rushing past the courthouse. James checked his watch, the same silver Rolex she'd bought him for their 5th anniversary when money was tighter but love was stronger. "Look, if this is some kind of act to delay the proceedings, it's not going to work. We've been over this 100 times. This marriage is done." But Natasha wasn't acting. She was dying, had been dying slowly for 2 years, and she'd never told him. How could she? Every time she tried to bring up her doctor visits, he'd brushed her off, too busy with his promotion, his golf games, his new life that apparently didn't include her. So she'd carried the secret alone, working double shifts at the diner to pay for tests and treatments he knew nothing about. A passerby stopped, an elderly woman with kind eyes who knelt beside Natasha despite her arthritis. "Honey, you need help. Should I call an ambulance?" "No," Natasha managed, though black spots were dancing in her vision. "I'm fine. Just tired." But she wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine since the doctor had used words like cardiomyopathy, and heart failure, and limited time. She'd sat in that sterile office alone, listening to her death sentence while James was at another work dinner she wasn't invited to, with colleagues who'd stopped asking about his wife years ago. "Ma'am, I'm calling 911, the woman said firmly, already dialing. "James Wilson, isn't it? I recognize you from the business section. This is your wife." James flushed, suddenly aware they were drawing attention. A small crowd had gathered, people pulling out phones, some to help, others to record. His political aspirations flashed before his eyes. The last thing he needed was a scene. "Yes, she gets overwhelmed sometimes," he said, finally stepping closer but still not touching her. "Natasha, come on. Let's just get through this and you can rest later." The paramedics arrived faster than anyone expected, their sirens cutting through the afternoon traffic. 2 EMTs jumped out, a young man and an older woman, both moving with practiced efficiency. "What's her name?" the female EMT asked, kneeling beside Natasha with a blood pressure cuff. "Natasha Wilson," James answered, though he seemed surprised they were asking him instead of her. "Natasha, I'm Patricia. Can you tell me what's wrong?" Natasha tried to focus on Patricia's face, but everything kept swimming. "My chest hurts. Can't breathe right." Patricia's fingers found her pulse, and Natasha saw the concern flash across her professional features. "How long has this been going on?" "Today, just today," James interrupted. "She's been fine." But Natasha was shaking her head weakly. "Months," she whispered. "Getting worse." Patricia shot a look at her partner, Tom, who was already preparing the stretcher. "BP's dangerously low, pulse is irregular. We need to move fast." As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Natasha caught sight of the divorce papers still scattered on the courthouse steps. The rain had blurred the ink, making the words run together like tears. 20 years of marriage reduced to soggy legal documents that would probably blow away before anyone thought to collect them. "Are you coming with us, sir?" Tom asked James. James looked at his watch again, then at the courthouse, then at his wife's gray face. Yes. I suppose I should." He climbed into the ambulance with the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to attend a funeral. Which, Natasha thought as consciousness finally slipped away from her, might not be far from the truth. The last thing she heard was Patricia radioing ahead to the hospital. Female, 42 years old, presenting with severe cardiac distress. Possible heart failure. 88 minutes. What Patricia couldn't radio ahead was the secret that would change everything. The secret that would bring a billionaire rushing to the hospital. The secret that would make James Wilson question every assumption he'd made about the woman he'd promised to love in sickness and in health, until death do them part. Death had been closer than he knew, and so had the discovery that would shatter his world and rebuild it in ways he never imagined. The emergency room doors burst open with a force that made every head turn. Patricia and Tom wheeled Natasha through the controlled chaos of Mercy General's trauma bay, her unconscious form looking impossibly small on the large stretcher. Machines beeped urgent warnings while nurses in colorful scrubs moved with the kind of precision that comes from seeing too much suffering. "What do we have?" Dr. Sarah Martinez called out, appearing at the stretcher's side like she'd materialized from thin air. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held the sharp focus of someone who'd learned to make life or death decisions in seconds. 42-year-old female, collapse outside courthouse, Patricia rattled off while they transferred Natasha to the examination bed. BP 60/40, irregular heartbeat, patient reports months of chest pain and breathing difficulties. Months? Dr. Martinez looked up sharply. Why wasn't she seen before? James stood in the corner, still dripping rainwater onto the sterile floor, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. She never said anything about being sick. She seemed fine to me. The doctor's expression didn't change, but several nurses exchanged glances. In their line of work, they'd seen too many spouses who somehow missed obvious signs of illness in their partners. "Sir, I need you to step outside while we work," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "The waiting room is down the hall." "Actually, I should probably get back to the courthouse," James started, but Patricia, who was still finishing her paperwork, looked at him with barely concealed disgust. "Your wife just collapsed. The courthouse can wait." Tom was already heading out for their next call, but he paused at the door. "Good luck," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes lingered on Natasha's still form. The examination room exploded into controlled activity. Nurses attached monitors, drew blood, started 4 lines. The steady beep 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 of the heart monitor filled the space, irregular and concerning. Dr. Martinez listened to Natasha's chest, her stethoscope moving from point to point with practiced efficiency. "Get me an EKG, chest X-ray and a full cardiac panel," she ordered. "And call Dr. Peterson from cardiology. Tell him we might have a cardiomyopathy case." James pressed closer to the glass partition separating him from the action. Through the thin walls, he could hear fragments of medical terminology that might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. Words like ejection fraction and ventricular dysfunction drifted out, each one sounding more ominous than the last. A young nurse named Kevin noticed him hovering and approached with a clipboard. "Sir, I need to get some information about your wife's medical history." "Her medical history?" James looked blank. "She's healthy. She was healthy. She goes to work, comes home, does the usual stuff." Kevin's pen hovered over the paper. "Any medication she takes regularly?" "Just vitamins, I think. Maybe some of that stuff women take for headaches." "Surgeries? Previous hospitalizations?" James shook his head, but doubt was creeping in. Had there been doctor visits he'd missed? Times when Natasha had mentioned not feeling well that he'd dismissed as tiredness or stress. Family history of heart disease? I don't know." The admission felt like a physical weight in his chest. 20 years of marriage, and he didn't know if his wife's family had heart problems. He didn't know what medications she took. He didn't know she'd been struggling to breathe for months. Inside the examination room, Natasha stirred as the medical team worked around her. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Natasha, you're in the hospital," Dr. Martinez said gently, leaning into her line of sight. "You collapsed outside the courthouse. Do you remember?" Natasha's hand moved instinctively to her chest. The pain was still there, a crushing weight that made each breath a conscious effort. "The divorce. Don't worry about that right now. We need to focus on your health. Can you tell me how long you've been having chest pain?" Natasha glanced toward the glass partition where she could see James pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. Even now, even here he was conducting business. "About 18 months, she whispered. "Maybe longer." Dr. Martinez frowned. 18 months? That's a long time to go without treatment. "Have you seen a doctor?" "Different doctors. Different clinics." Natasha's voice was weak but steady. "Paid cash. Didn't want it on our insurance." The pieces were starting to come together for Dr. Martinez. A woman hiding her illness, paying for medical care out of pocket, ending up in the ER on the day of her divorce. She'd seen this story before and it never ended well. "Natasha, I need to be honest with you. Your heart is in serious trouble. We need to run more tests, but from what I can see so far, you're in heart failure." The words hit like a physical blow, even though Natasha had heard them before from other doctors in other emergency rooms, during other crisis moments she'd faced alone. "How serious?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Serious enough that you need immediate treatment." The good news is we've made tremendous advances in cardiac care. But you're going to need surgery, probably sooner rather than later. Through the glass, James had finished his phone call and was staring at the medical team working around his wife. For the first time since they'd arrived, he looked genuinely worried. Dr. Martinez followed his gaze. Is that your husband? Does he know about your condition? Natasha shook her head slightly. We were getting divorced today. Seemed pointless to complicate things. Natasha, heart surgery is expensive. Very expensive. And recovery takes months. You're going to need support. I'll manage. I always do. But even as she said the words, Natasha knew they weren't true. She'd been managing by working herself into the ground, by ignoring symptoms until they couldn't be ignored, by spending her savings on medical bills while pretending everything was fine. The managing had brought her here, to this bed, with machines keeping track of her failing heart. The X-ray technician arrived with portable equipment, and Dr. Martinez stepped out to speak with James. He looked up from his phone, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mr. Wilson, we need to talk. Dr. Martinez led James to a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and contained 2 uncomfortable chairs, a box of tissues, and a poster about heart health that seemed to mock the situation. James sat on the edge of his chair, his expensive suit wrinkled now, his usual composure cracking. Your wife is very sick, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Martinez began without preamble. She'd learned that delaying bad news only made it harder to deliver. She has what we call dilated cardiomyopathy. Her heart muscle is enlarged and weak, and it's not pumping blood effectively. James stared at her, processing the words slowly. But she never said anything. She's been working, going about her normal routine. Many people with heart failure learn to adapt to their limitations gradually. They cut back on activities, rest more, but they don't always recognize the symptoms as serious medical issues. Dr. Martinez pulled out a tablet, swiping to Natasha's X-ray images. This has been developing for quite some time. Your wife mentioned 18 months of symptoms. 18 months. James felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. That's impossible. I would have noticed. Dr. Martinez's expression remained neutral, but she'd heard this denial countless times before. The tests show she's been seeking medical treatment at various clinics. She's been paying out of pocket, which suggests she was trying to handle this privately. The words hit James like physical blows. 18 months. Multiple doctors. Paying cash. While he'd been complaining about their finances, irritated by their dwindling social life, frustrated by her lack of energy, Natasha had been fighting for her life in silence. What kind of treatment does she need? He asked, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Surgery. We're talking about a procedure that could cost anywhere from $200,000 to $400,000, depending on complications. James felt the world tilt beneath him. Their insurance was basic coverage through his job, good for routine care but with massive deductibles for major procedures. Their savings account, what little there was left, wouldn't cover even a fraction of that cost. There has to be another option, he said desperately. Medication, therapy, something less. Mr. Wilson, without surgical intervention, your wife has maybe 6 months. With surgery she could have decades. But it needs to happen soon. Her heart function is deteriorating rapidly. 6 months. The number echoed in James's mind. 6 months ago he'd been planning their divorce, calculating how to split assets, thinking about his future without Natasha. He'd never imagined a future where she simply wouldn't exist. Can I see her? Dr. Martinez nodded and led him back to the examination room. Natasha was awake now, propped up slightly with oxygen tubes in her nose. The monitors around her bed painted a grim picture with their irregular beeping and flashing numbers. Hey, James said awkwardly, approaching the bed like she was made of fragile glass. Hey. Natasha's voice was barely above a whisper. Sorry about the courthouse. I know you wanted to get this finished today. The casualness of her apology, as if collapsing from heart failure was merely an inconvenience, made James's chest tighten with something that might have been guilt or grief or both. Natasha, why didn't you tell me you were sick? She turned her head slightly to look at him, and for a moment, he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. Before the distance, before the arguments, before the slow erosion of everything good between them. When would I have told you? She asked simply. During one of our fights about money? When you were working late every night? When you started staying at hotels instead of coming home? Each question was like a small knife finding its mark. James sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, realizing that somewhere along the way, he'd become a stranger to his own wife. I found some papers in your purse, he admitted. Bills from different medical clinics. Lab reports. Prescription receipts. How long have you been dealing with this alone? Since the first chest pain, Natasha said. I thought it was stress. Then I thought it was getting older. Then the doctor at the free clinic told me what it really was. Free clinic. On 5th Street. They have a program for people who can't afford regular health care. Natasha's eyes closed briefly. I've been working extra shifts at the diner to pay for tests. That's why I'm always tired, James. Not because I don't want to spend time with you, but because I'm working 18-hour days to pay for medications that keep me alive. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. All those arguments about her lack of energy, all those times he'd accused her of being lazy or uninterested in their marriage, and she'd been working herself to death. Literally. The money from our joint account, he said slowly, pieces clicking into place. The withdrawals I couldn't account for. Cardiologist appointments. Echocardiograms. Medications. Each item on her list represented hours of extra work, tips saved dollar by dollar, a secret life of medical appointments and financial struggle. James put his head in his hands. My God, Natasha. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I didn't want you to know. We were already falling apart. I didn't want to add sick wife to your list of problems. But even as she said it, Natasha wondered if things might have been different if she'd trusted him with the truth. Maybe the knowledge that she was fighting for her life would have reminded him why he'd loved her in the first place. Maybe it would have brought them together instead of driving them apart. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway with a tablet in her hand. I have the results of your cardiac panel, Natasha. Your heart function is at about 20% of normal. We need to schedule surgery within the next 2 weeks, ideally sooner. Doctor. James stood up, his voice shaky. About payment arrangements. Our financial counselor will work with you on that. But I have to be honest, a procedure this complex, with the need for potential complications, you're looking at significant out-of-pocket costs even with insurance. James looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was pale, exhausted, and fighting the biggest battle of her life. And she'd been doing it alone while he'd been planning to abandon her. Whatever it costs, he heard himself say. Whatever we have to do. We'll figure it out. Natasha's eyes filled with tears. James, you don't understand. This could bankrupt us. And for what? So I can live a few more years while you're stuck with medical bills and a sick wife you don't even want anymore? Don't say that. His voice was fierce, surprising them both. Don't you ever say that. But the question remained, hanging in the air between them like a challenge. How do you save a marriage when you're trying to save a life? And what happens when the cost of both might be more than either of them can bear? Outside in the hospital corridor, a well-dressed man was asking questions at the information desk. He had the kind of presence that made people pay attention, the kind of urgency that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. But nobody in room 314 knew that yet. Nobody knew that help was coming from the most unexpected source, or that Natasha's secret was about to become the key to saving not just her life, but everything she'd thought she'd lost. The financial counselor's office felt more like a funeral parlor than a place of hope. Sandra Phillips had delivered bad news to families for 15 years, but she still hated this part of her job. Across from her desk, James Wilson sat with his head in his hands while papers covered in astronomical numbers spread between them like a roadmap to bankruptcy. With your insurance, after deductibles and co-pays, you're looking at approximately $180,000 out of pocket, Sandra said gently. She'd learned to deliver these figures matter-of-factly, without cushioning them in false comfort. James looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. 180,000. That's if everything goes perfectly. If there are complications, extended hospital stays, additional procedures. Sandra trailed off. They both knew the number could climb much higher. What are our options? Sandra pulled out a different folder. Medical loans, but with interest rates between 12 and 20%. Home equity if you have it. Family assistance. Crowdfunding has become popular, though success isn't guaranteed. James thought about their modest 2-bedroom house, the mortgage they still owed, the credit cards they'd already maxed out during lean times. His salary as a mid-level manager was decent but not wealthy. Natasha's waitressing income had always been their safety net, the extra money that kept them afloat. Now he understood why that safety net had been shrinking. Can we set up a payment plan? The hospital requires 50% upfront for elective surgeries. The rest can be arranged in payments, but... Sandra hesitated. Mr. Wilson, I have to ask. Is your wife aware of your financial situation? What do you mean? I mean, does she know that saving her life might cost you your house? Your retirement? Your financial future? James was quiet for a long moment. She knows. She's been telling me we can't afford the surgery. She wants to. He couldn't finish the sentence. She wants to refuse treatment, Sandra said quietly. She says it's not fair to destroy my life for a few extra years of hers. James's voice broke slightly. But they might not be just a few years. The doctor said with surgery she could live a normal lifespan. Sandra had seen this scenario too many times. Families torn apart not by illness but by the cost of fighting it. Good people forced to choose between financial ruin and losing someone they loved. There's one other option I should mention, she said carefully. Some patients choose to wait. To try medication management first, see if that improves their condition enough to buy time. Time for what? Sometimes circumstances change. Family assistance becomes available. Insurance situations improve. It's not ideal but... James shook his head. Dr. Martinez said waiting could be fatal. That her heart is deteriorating rapidly. It's a risk, yes. They sat in silence for several minutes. Outside Sandra's office window, life continued normally. People walking to their cars, complaining about traffic, worrying about ordinary problems. None of them facing the impossible choice between love and financial survival. I need to talk to my wife, James finally said. Back in room 314, Natasha was awake but weak. The oxygen tubes made her voice sound different, smaller somehow. James pulled his chair close to her bed, close enough that he could take her hand without the nurses noticing and disapproving. What did the money lady say? Natasha asked. Don't call her that. James managed a weak smile. Her name is Sandra, and she's trying to help us figure this out. How bad? James looked into his wife's eyes and realized he couldn't lie to her anymore. They'd built too many walls with half-truths and hidden problems. Bad. Really bad. Natasha closed her eyes. The house. Probably. Your retirement? Gone. James, I can't let you do that. I won't let you destroy your life for me. What life? The words came out harsher than he intended. You think I want a life without you in it? You think I want to grow old alone, knowing I could have saved you but chose money instead? But the debt, James. You'll spend the rest of your life paying for a few extra years with me. And what if the surgery doesn't work? What if there are complications? What if I survive but I'm disabled, and you're stuck caring for someone who can't contribute anything to the household? Each question was like a physical blow, but James could see she'd been thinking about this for months. While he'd been worried about their marriage, she'd been calculating the cost of her own life. Do you remember our wedding vows? He asked suddenly. James? In sickness and in health. For richer or poorer. Till death do us part. He squeezed her hand gently. I know I haven't been good at honoring those lately. I know I've been a terrible husband. But I'm not going to fail this test too. Tears were rolling down Natasha's cheeks. But what if we lose everything and I die anyway? Then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I didn't give up on us. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Martinez entered with a clipboard and a serious expression that had become familiar over the past few hours. I have good news and bad news, she announced. The good news is we've stabilized your condition enough to give us some time to plan the surgery properly. The bad news is that time is limited. I'd like to schedule the procedure for next week. Next week? James felt panic rising in his chest. We haven't figured out the financial arrangements yet. I understand, but waiting longer increases the risk significantly. Every day we delay, your wife's heart function deteriorates a little more. Natasha looked between her husband and her doctor. What if I refuse the surgery? Natasha, no, James said immediately. I need to know my options, James. She turned to Dr. Martinez. If I refuse surgery, what happens? Dr. Martinez set down her clipboard. Medication can manage your symptoms for a while. Maybe a few months, possibly longer if you're very careful about your activity level, your diet, stress management. But eventually I die. Yes. But James doesn't go bankrupt trying to save me. Natasha, stop talking like this, James pleaded. But Dr. Martinez was looking at Natasha with something that might have been respect. It's your choice to make. But I want you to understand something. Heart failure patients who receive appropriate surgical intervention have survival rates above 80%. Those who don't have survival rates near zero. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. James felt like he was drowning, surrounded by impossible choices and inadequate resources. Everything he'd worked for, everything they built together, might not be enough to save the woman he was just remembering how to love. There's one more thing, Dr. Martinez said quietly. Sometimes patients in your situation reach out to medical foundations, charitable organizations. It's not common for them to cover procedures this expensive, but it's worth exploring. Charity? Natasha said bitterly. I never thought it would come to this. Pride doesn't cure heart disease, Dr. Martinez replied gently. Sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing you can do. After the doctor left, James and Natasha sat in silence. The weight of the decision ahead of them felt crushing, impossible to bear. Neither of them knew that help was already on its way, that a stranger with the resources to change everything was asking questions at the nurse's station, trying to find the right room. Neither of them knew that Natasha's secret life was about to collide with their desperate reality in ways that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation, their marriage, and the value of the hidden gifts she'd been sharing with the world. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor with a soft ding that seemed too cheerful for the circumstances. Michael Thompson stepped out, his hand-tailored charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes immediately setting him apart from the typical hospital visitors in their wrinkled clothes and worried expressions. He moved with purpose, but his usual confidence was tempered by something that looked remarkably like anxiety. At the nurse's station, he approached the first available staff member, a middle-aged woman named Carol whose 20 years of experience had taught her to read people quickly. Rich or poor, everyone looked the same when they were scared about someone they loved. Excuse me, Michael said, his voice polite but urgent. I'm looking for Natasha Wilson. She was admitted earlier today. Carol looked up from her charts, taking in the expensive suit, the worried expression, the way this man's hands were trembling slightly despite his composed demeanor. Are you family? Michael hesitated. How could he explain that he was looking for a woman he'd never met in person, someone he knew only through emails and late-night phone consultations? Someone whose real name he'd just learned today through a desperate search after seeing a news report about a courthouse collapse? I'm a close friend. A business associate. I just found out she was here. Carol's expression softened. She'd seen plenty of people struggle to define relationships that were important but not traditional. Room 314, but visiting hours end at 8. Are you aware of her condition? Heart failure, Michael said quietly. I understand she needs surgery. That's right. Are you? Carol paused, studying his face. Are you the husband? You seem very concerned. No, the husband is already here. I'm just someone who cares about her very much. Carol nodded and pointed down the hallway. Room 314 is the third door on the left. Fair warning, it's been a difficult day for the family. Michael walked slowly down the corridor, his mind racing. For 2 years, he'd been corresponding with someone who signed their emails simply as N. Wilson, business consultant. Their relationship had been purely professional at first. He'd found her through an online consulting platform, hired her to review a merger proposal that his regular advisors had approved. She'd torn the deal apart in a 15-page analysis that had saved him $30 million. After that, he'd kept her on retainer, sending her complex business problems that his Harvard MBA team couldn't solve. Corporate restructuring plans, market analysis, investment strategies, everything he sent her, she handled with a brilliance that left him amazed. Her insights were sharp, creative, and consistently profitable. But she'd always refused his attempts to meet in person, declined his invitations to join his company as a full-time executive, turned down stock options that would have made her wealthy. She insisted on being paid modest consulting fees and nothing more. He'd respected her privacy, but he'd also wondered about the person behind the razor-sharp intelligence and humble demeanor. Yesterday everything had changed. A colleague had shown him a local news article about a woman collapsing outside the courthouse, and the name Natasha Wilson had jumped out at him. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but something about it had made him search deeper. Hospital records were private, but Michael Thompson had resources and connections. It had taken 6 hours and several phone calls to confirm what he'd suspected. His anonymous consultant was fighting for her life. Now he stood outside room 314, unsure of what he'd find or what he could possibly say. Through the small window in the door, he could see a man in a rumpled suit sitting beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a woman who looked nothing like the powerhouse intellect he'd imagined. Natasha Wilson was small, fragile-looking, with graying hair and skin that seemed too pale. She was awake, talking quietly with the man who must be her husband, but even from a distance, Michael could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. He knocked gently and waited for permission before entering. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, stepping into the room carefully. I'm looking for Natasha Wilson. Both James and Natasha looked up, surprised by the interruption and clearly puzzled by this well-dressed stranger who seemed to know Natasha's name. I'm Natasha, she said weakly. Do we know each other? Michael approached the bed slowly, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or financial pressure. We've never met in person, but we've worked together for 2 years. I'm Michael Thompson. The name didn't seem to register with James, but Natasha's eyes widened slightly. Her hand moved to her chest, not from pain this time but from shock. Michael Thompson. The Thompson Industries Michael Thompson? Yes. Michael pulled out his phone, scrolling to their email correspondence. You've been my business consultant since 2023. Wilson. You saved my company from a disastrous merger with Hartwell Corporation. James looked between his wife and this stranger, confusion clear on his face. Natasha, what is he talking about? But Natasha was staring at Michael like she'd seen a ghost. How did you find me? I saw the news report about someone collapsing at the courthouse. The name was familiar, so I investigated. When I realized it was you. Michael ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his usual corporate persona. I had to come. I had to make sure you were all right. I don't understand, James said, looking back and forth between them. Natasha, you know this man? Not exactly, Natasha whispered. We've never met. It's all been emails and phone calls. Michael moved closer to the bed, his voice gentle but urgent. Natasha, I need you to understand something. The work you've done for me over the past 2 years hasn't just been consulting. You've been instrumental in building my company. Every major decision I've made, every successful investment, every crisis we've navigated, your insights have been behind all of it. That's impossible, James interrupted. Natasha works at a diner. She's a waitress. Michael turned to look at James, and for a moment, his expression was almost pitying. Your wife is one of the most brilliant business minds I've ever encountered. She's helped me turn a $50 million company into a $2 billion empire. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. James felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His wife, who he'd seen as someone content with a simple life, someone without ambition or drive, had been secretly building an empire with a billionaire? The late nights, James said slowly, pieces clicking together. When you said you were doing paperwork from the diner? I was working, Natasha confirmed quietly. On Michael's projects. On business plans and market analysis. But why? James asked, his voice strained. Why keep it secret? Natasha closed her eyes briefly. Because you already resented how tired I was, how little energy I had for our marriage. If you'd known I was spending my free time on a second job. This wasn't just a second job, Michael interrupted gently. Natasha, the compensation I've been paying you, it's been far below what your contributions were worth. I kept trying to offer you more, stock options, profit sharing, but you always declined. James felt sick. How much? I've been paying her $5,000 a month for work that's worth at least $50,000, Michael admitted. She insisted on keeping the payments small. Said she didn't want to complicate her life. The numbers hit James like physical blows. $5,000 a month for 2 years. That was money that could have covered medical expenses, reduced their financial stress, maybe even saved their marriage before it reached the breaking point. Natasha, why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you turn down that kind of money? Because I knew it would change everything between us, she said simply. You were already feeling inadequate about your salary, your career. If you'd known I was earning more than you. So you chose to struggle? To work yourself sick? To hide your illness because you thought I couldn't handle the truth about who you really are? Michael watched this exchange with growing understanding. He'd wondered why his brilliant consultant lived such a modest life, why she'd never taken advantage of the opportunities he'd offered. Now he was seeing the cost of her choices written across both their faces. There's something else you need to know, Michael said quietly. Natasha, the project you've been working on for the past 6 months? The market expansion plan? She nodded weakly. It's going to net the company approximately $200 million in profits over the next 3 years. Your strategic insights identified market opportunities that my entire research team missed. James sank into his chair, overwhelmed. His wife wasn't just brilliant. She was responsible for profits that exceeded their combined lifetime earnings by thousands of times over. Why are you telling us this now? James asked. Michael looked at Natasha, then back at James. Because I owe her far more than I can ever repay. Because for 2 years she's been the silent partner in everything I've built, and I never even knew her face. And because... He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Because I just found out that the person who's been saving my business empire is dying because she can't afford to save herself. The irony was devastating and clear to all of them. Natasha had been generating millions in profits for someone else while secretly facing financial ruin over her own medical bills. The surgery, Michael continued, whatever it costs, I want to cover it. No, Natasha said immediately, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Absolutely not. Natasha, you don't understand. This isn't charity. This is me finally paying you what you're worth. I said no. Her tone was final, despite her physical weakness. I won't accept your money. Michael looked at James desperately. Make her understand. This is the least I can do. She's earned this 100 times over. But James was staring at his wife, seeing her with completely new eyes. The woman he'd thought was content with a simple life had been living a secret existence as a business strategist for one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs. The woman he'd accused of lacking ambition had been turning down opportunities that most people could only dream of. Natasha, he said quietly, why didn't you trust me with this? She turned to look at him and for the first time in months really looked at him. Because I was afraid you'd feel like I was trying to make you smaller. And because I was afraid that if you knew what I was capable of, you'd expect me to be someone I wasn't sure I could be all the time. Michael cleared his throat. I don't mean to interrupt, but we need to discuss the immediate situation. Natasha needs surgery and from what I understand, cost is an issue. It's not your problem to solve, Natasha said firmly. Yes, it is. Michael's voice was equally firm. You've been my business partner for 2 years even if neither of us defined it that way. Partners take care of each other. James looked between his wife and this stranger who seemed to know her better than he did. Everything he'd thought he'd known about their life, their marriage, their problems, was being rewritten in the space of a single conversation. The question was, what happened next? How did a marriage survive the revelation that one partner had been living an entire secret life? And how did 3 people navigate a situation where love, money, pride, and survival were all tangled together in ways that defied easy solutions? Dr. Martinez returned to find 3 people in room 314 instead of 2, and the atmosphere had changed completely. Where before there had been quiet desperation, now there was an electric tension that made her pause in the doorway. I'm sorry, visiting hours are almost over, she said looking at Michael. Are you family? James started, then stopped, realizing he didn't know how to explain Michael's relationship to his wife. I'm a business associate, Michael said smoothly. I've been working with Mrs. Wilson on several projects. I just learned about her condition. Dr. Martinez nodded and approached Natasha's bed with her tablet. How are you feeling? Any increase in chest pain or difficulty breathing? About the same, Natasha replied, though her voice carried a stress that hadn't been there earlier. Good. I wanted to update you on the surgical schedule. We've reserved an operating room for Thursday morning. That gives us 3 days to complete pre-operative preparations. Thursday, James repeated, the word hitting him like a deadline for everything. Their marriage, their finances, their future. Dr. Martinez, Michael said, I'd like to discuss covering the cost of Mrs. Wilson's surgery. The doctor looked surprised but pleased. That's very generous. You'll need to coordinate with our financial services department. No, Natasha said firmly. I already told him no. Dr. Martinez looked around the room, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. Perhaps this is a conversation for the family to have privately? Could you give us a few minutes? James asked. After the doctor left, Michael turned to Natasha with an expression of gentle frustration. You're being stubborn about this. I'm being realistic. I won't be in debt to you for the rest of my life. What life? Michael's voice was sharper than he'd intended. Without this surgery, you don't have a rest of your life. James watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 20 years of marriage, he'd rarely seen Natasha stand her ground so firmly with anyone. She was usually the peacekeeper, the one who avoided conflict. But with Michael, she was arguing like an equal. Explain something to me, James said suddenly. How does someone who works at a diner become a business consultant for a billionaire? Michael and Natasha looked at each other, and James saw a communication pass between them that spoke of long familiarity despite their claim of never having met. It started by accident, Natasha said quietly. I was working late at the diner using their Wi-Fi to take online courses. Business administration, accounting, marketing. I'd always been good with numbers, good at seeing patterns. Online courses with what money? James asked. Tips. Extra shifts. I saved every dollar I could. Natasha's voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted to surprise you. I thought if I could develop some business skills, maybe I could get a better job, contribute more to our household. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. While he'd been dismissive of her waitressing career, she'd been secretly working to improve herself, to become more valuable to their partnership. Michael picked up the story. I was looking for a consultant through an online platform. Most of the applicants had impressive credentials but gave me generic advice. And Wilson was different. She asked questions no one else asked, saw angles no one else saw. What kind of questions? James found himself genuinely curious about this hidden side of his wife. About employee morale during the merger, Natasha said. About how the company cultures would mesh. Michael's advisors were focused on financial projections, but I could see the human element was going to make or break the deal. Michael nodded. She identified 17 potential conflict points that my expensive consulting firm missed. Her recommendations saved the merger and probably saved the company. So you kept working together, James said. 3 or 4 projects a year, Michael confirmed. Market analysis, corporate strategy, investment evaluation. Each time, Natasha's insights were brilliant. James looked at his wife with new eyes. The nights you were too tired to talk about my work problems? I was working on billion-dollar strategic decisions, Natasha admitted. I couldn't exactly say, sorry honey, I'm busy preventing a corporate disaster. But why keep it secret from me? Natasha was quiet for a long moment. Do you remember when you got passed over for the promotion 2 years ago? James nodded. It had been a difficult time, a blow to his ego and their finances. You came home that night and said you felt like a failure. Said you couldn't even provide properly for your wife. Natasha's voice was gentle but sad. How could I tell you that I was earning more in a month than you made in 6 months? How could I tell you that while you were struggling at work, I was helping build an empire? The answer hung in the air between them. She couldn't because it would have destroyed what was left of his confidence, his sense of purpose, his role as a husband and provider. Michael was watching this conversation with growing understanding. You protected his ego at the cost of your own security. I protected our marriage, Natasha corrected. Or I tried to. But it didn't work, James said quietly. We still fell apart. We still ended up at the courthouse today. Because I was exhausted, Natasha admitted. Working 2 jobs, hiding a medical condition, trying to keep up with everything. I had nothing left to give to our relationship. James sat in silence, processing 2 years of misunderstanding. He'd blamed Natasha for their growing distance, her lack of energy, her disinterest in social activities. He'd never imagined she was carrying the weight of secret responsibilities that dwarfed his own. There's something else, Michael said carefully. Natasha, the work you've been doing, it's not just consulting. You've been developing strategies that have become integral to how we operate. You've essentially been functioning as an unofficial partner. What does that mean? James asked. Michael hesitated. It means she's entitled to far more than consulting fees. The profits generated by her strategies, the value she's added to the company, we're talking about millions of dollars in compensation. Millions? James felt dizzy. Which is why covering the surgery isn't charity, Michael continued. It's a business obligation. It's paying someone what they've earned. But Natasha was shaking her head. I chose the consulting arrangement. I chose the modest payments. You don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed on. What if we change the agreement? Michael asked. What if I offered you a partnership? Formal recognition for what you've been doing all along? I'm not going to live long enough for it to matter. You are if you have the surgery. The conversation was going in circles, but James was beginning to understand something important. Michael Thompson hadn't come to the hospital as a generous benefactor offering charity to a sick woman. He'd come as a business partner trying to save someone who'd been instrumental to his success. Can I ask you something, Michael? James said. Of course. If Natasha hadn't gotten sick, if this hadn't happened, would you have ever tried to meet her? To offer her more recognition, more compensation? Michael was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I don't know. She seemed to prefer the anonymous arrangement. I respected that, but I always wondered about the person behind the brilliant strategies. And now you know, James said. She's a woman who works double shifts at a diner to put herself through online business courses. A woman who hides a heart condition because she doesn't want to burden anyone. A woman who turns down opportunities that would change her life because she's trying to protect other people's feelings. Michael nodded slowly. She's remarkable. James looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not the tired, distant woman he'd been planning to divorce, but someone who'd been carrying extraordinary burdens with grace and selflessness. "Natasha," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." She turned to look at him, her eyes tired but alert. "If you live through this surgery, if Michael offers you this partnership, what do you want to do? Not what you think I want to hear, not what you think will protect my feelings, but what do you actually want?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time in years, someone was asking Natasha Wilson what she wanted for herself, what dreams she'd been carrying in secret, what possibilities she'd been too afraid to voice. Her answer would change everything. Natasha stared at the ceiling tiles for a long moment, her breathing shallow but steady. The question James had asked, "What do you actually want?" seemed to echo in the small room, bouncing off medical equipment and monitors that had become the soundtrack to her crisis. "I want to tell you about the Henderson account," she said finally, her voice so quiet that both men had to lean closer to hear her. Michael's eyes widened. "Natasha, that's confidential." "Not anymore." She turned her head to look at James. 6 months ago, Michael's company was approached by Henderson Manufacturing. They wanted to partner with Thompson Industries to expand into international markets. James nodded, not understanding the significance but recognizing that this was important to her. Henderson is worth about $800 million. The partnership would have been huge for both companies, but there were problems with their proposal. Cultural barriers, regulatory issues, supply chain concerns that could have cost millions. Michael was watching her with something that looked like pride and sadness combined. She spent 3 weeks analyzing every aspect of the deal. "I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night," Natasha continued. "I was researching international trade laws, studying economic conditions in 6 different countries, analyzing currency fluctuations. James, you kept asking why I was so tired, why I fell asleep during movies." "You were working," James said, understanding dawning. "I was rewriting a multimillion-dollar international expansion plan." Natasha's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I identified 47 potential problems with Henderson's original proposal. I developed alternative strategies for market entry, restructured their supply chain recommendations, and created contingency plans for political instability in 3 key regions." Michael pulled out his phone and showed James a series of documents. Her final analysis was 230 pages. It was more comprehensive than anything my paid consulting firms had ever produced. James scrolled through pages of charts, graphs, and detailed analysis, all attributed to N. Wilson, strategic consultant. The complexity was staggering, the depth of research impressive by any professional standard. "What happened with the deal?" James asked. "We implemented every one of her recommendations," Michael said. "The Henderson partnership has generated $96 million in profits in 6 months. We're projecting over $300 million in profits over the next 2 years. "And you did this while working at the diner?" James said, looking at his wife with amazement. "During my breaks, after my shifts, on my days off. I carried a laptop in my car. Sometimes I'd sit in the parking lot after work and research currency exchange rates or international shipping regulations." Michael shook his head. "She turned down a consulting fee of $200,000 for that project. Insisted on her usual $5,000. $200,000? James felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "I told her it was worth at least that much. She said it would complicate her taxes." Michael looked at Natasha with gentle frustration. "What she didn't know was that her Henderson analysis convinced me to restructure how we approach all international deals. Her methodology has become our standard operating procedure." James was quiet, processing the magnitude of what his wife had accomplished in secret. "What other projects have you worked on?" "The Morrison acquisition," Natasha said. "The European market expansion. The supply chain reorganization after the shipping crisis last year." Each project name hit Michael like a reminder of his debt to her. "Every major success my company has had in the past 2 years can be traced back to her insights." "But you never took credit," James observed. "I didn't want credit. I wanted to be useful." Natasha's eyes filled with tears. "For 20 years, I felt like I wasn't contributing enough to our marriage, to our finances, to our future. When I discovered I had this ability to analyze business problems, it felt like I'd found a purpose. A purpose you kept secret. Because I was afraid." The admission came out like a confession. "I was afraid that if I told you I was capable of this level of work, you'd expect me to pursue it full time. And I was afraid that if I became successful, it would make you feel smaller." Michael cleared his throat. There's something else she doesn't know. Natasha, the strategies you've developed haven't just helped Thompson Industries. I've been approached by 3 other companies asking if they can hire the consultant who worked on the Henderson deal. What do you mean? Natasha asked. Word has gotten out in business circles about the quality of your work. I've had to turn down requests from CEOs who want to hire N. Wilson for their own strategic planning. James looked between them. Are you saying there's demand for Natasha's services beyond just your company? I'm saying she could start her own consulting firm tomorrow and have more clients than she could handle, Michael said. I'm saying she's developed a reputation as one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the industry, and she doesn't even know it. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. James tried to wrap his mind around the idea that his wife had unknowingly built a reputation in a field she'd never formally entered, while working nights at a diner and hiding a life-threatening illness. Why are you telling me this now? Natasha asked Michael. Because I want you to understand what you're giving up if you refuse the surgery. You're not just a sick woman who can't afford medical care. You're a business strategist who's generated hundreds of millions in profits and revolutionized how international deals are structured. I'm a waitress with a heart condition. You're a brilliant consultant who happens to work at a diner, Michael corrected. There's a difference. James stood up and walked to the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, business leaders were implementing strategies his wife had developed. Companies were making profits based on her insights. An entire industry had been influenced by someone they knew only as N. Wilson. I need to ask you both something, he said without turning around. And I need honest answers. Okay, Natasha said quietly. Michael, if Natasha recovers from this surgery, what exactly are you offering her? Michael straightened in his chair. A full partnership in Thompson Industries. Equity stake, profit sharing, formal recognition as Chief Strategic Officer. Starting salary of $500,000 annually, plus bonuses based on the profits generated by her strategies. James turned around. $500,000. That's the starting offer. Based on her track record, she'd likely earn over $1 million annually within 2 years. James looked at his wife. And Natasha, if you had that opportunity, if money wasn't a concern and you could choose any life you wanted, what would you do? Natasha closed her eyes. I'd want to do the work. I love the challenge, the problem solving, the feeling of building something important. But I'd want to do it with you supporting me, not resenting me for it. And what if I can't handle being married to someone more successful than I am? James asked. What if my ego can't take it? Then we'd deal with that together, Natasha said simply. But we'd deal with it honestly, not with secrets and hidden resentments. Michael watched this conversation with growing hope. Does this mean you'll consider the surgery? Natasha looked at James, then at Michael, then at the monitors that were keeping track of her failing heart. If I agree to the surgery, if I accept your offer to cover the costs, what happens to us afterward? How do we navigate a relationship where one person owes the other person their life? We don't think of it as owing, Michael said. We think of it as partners taking care of each other. And if I accept the partnership, if I become Chief Strategic Officer of a billion-dollar company, how do we navigate a marriage where the wife suddenly earns 10 times what the husband makes? James came back to her bedside and took her hand. We figure it out together. We go to counseling, we communicate honestly, we work through the challenges. But we do it with you alive. Natasha squeezed his hand gently. Are you sure? Are you sure you can handle loving someone whose life turned out bigger than either of us expected? James looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not the woman he'd been planning to divorce, but the woman he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. The woman who was apparently brilliant enough to build business empires while serving coffee and hiding her own medical crisis. I'm sure I don't want to live without you, he said. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. The hospital corridors were quieter at night, but sleep was impossible for James. He'd left Natasha's room only because the nurses insisted she needed rest before tomorrow's pre-operative procedures. Now he sat in the family lounge, surrounded by empty vending machines and uncomfortable chairs, trying to process everything that had changed in a single day. Michael Thompson sat across from him, jacket draped over the back of his chair, looking exhausted despite his usual polished appearance. Neither man had spoken for 20 minutes, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people trying to understand how they'd arrived at this moment. Can I ask you something personal? James finally said. Michael nodded. When you first started working with Natasha, when she was just N. Wilson to you, what made her different from other consultants? Michael leaned back, considering the question. She asked me why I cared about the answer. What do you mean? Most consultants would take a problem I gave them and solve it efficiently. Give me data, projections, recommendations. Natasha would email me back with questions like, what outcome would make you feel like this decision was worth the risk? Or, what keeps you awake at night about this deal? James found himself smiling slightly. She does that. Did that. When we were younger, she'd ask me those kinds of questions about my job, my goals. She understood that business decisions aren't just financial. They're emotional, personal, strategic in ways that go beyond profit margins. Michael ran a hand through his hair. She'd send me analysis that included sections on employee morale, community impact, long-term sustainability. Things my Harvard MBAs never considered. But you never wondered who she was? Never tried to find out more about her? Michael was quiet for a moment. I did wonder. Especially when she'd send me insights that seemed to come from real-world experience, not just theoretical knowledge. But she was clear about maintaining professional boundaries, so I respected that. What kind of real-world experience? Customer service insights that could only come from working directly with people. Understanding of cash flow problems that seemed too specific to be academic. Knowledge about employee fatigue, workplace dynamics, the challenges of managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. James realized what Michael was describing. She was writing about her own life. Exactly. When she analyzed employee retention strategies, she was drawing on her experience watching coworkers burn out at the diner. When she recommended customer service improvements, she understood both sides of those interactions. The realization hit James with unexpected force. His wife hadn't just been hiding a second career from him. She'd been transforming her daily experiences into strategic insights worth millions of dollars. I've been such a fool, James said quietly. How so? I saw her job at the diner as beneath us, I guess. Something she did because she wasn't qualified for anything better. I never realized she was using it as a laboratory for understanding business operations. Michael nodded. She once wrote a 20-page analysis of supply chain optimization based on observations from restaurant inventory management. It saved my company $3 million in logistics costs. James shook his head in amazement. While I was complaining about the smell of grease in her hair when she came home from work. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have asked better questions, paid more attention, cared more about what she was thinking and feeling. James looked at Michael. Can I tell you something that makes me sound terrible? Sure. 6 months ago, I started planning the divorce because I felt like I was married to someone who'd given up on life. Someone without ambition or dreams or the energy to build anything meaningful. James's voice was thick with shame. I thought I was married to someone who'd settled for less than she was capable of. And now I realize I was married to someone who was building an empire while letting me think I was the breadwinner. Someone who was fighting a terminal illness while working 2 jobs and taking care of me and our household. Someone who was so concerned about my feelings that she sacrificed her own success to protect my ego. Michael was quiet, letting James work through his realizations. The worst part is she was right to hide it from me. If she told me 2 years ago that she was earning more money than I was, that she was consulting for billion-dollar companies, that she was brilliant at something I'd never even considered trying, I would have resented her for it. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Because when I got passed over for that promotion, I came home and took my frustration out on her. I criticized her job, her energy level, her contribution to our household. If I'd known she was out-earning me by a factor of 10. James trailed off. You think it would have made things worse? I know it would have. My ego couldn't handle the idea that my wife was more successful than I was. So she protected my feelings by hiding her own success, and then I used her apparent lack of success as justification for giving up on our marriage. The truth of it sat between them like a weight. James had created a situation where his wife couldn't win. If she told him about her success, it would threaten his sense of masculine pride. If she hid it to protect him, it made her seem directionless and unmotivated. She must have felt so alone, James said. I think she did. But she chose that loneliness to preserve your marriage. And it didn't work anyway. We still ended up at the courthouse today. Michael looked at him carefully. But you're not at the courthouse now. No. I'm here trying to figure out how to be worthy of a woman I never deserved in the first place. James, can I give you some business advice? James looked up, curious. When I make a mistake in business, I have 2 choices. I can spend my energy feeling guilty about the mistake, or I can spend my energy fixing the consequences of the mistake. Guilt is a luxury you can't afford when someone's life is on the line. Meaning? Meaning figure out who you want to be tomorrow, not who you were yesterday. Your wife needs you to be strong enough to handle her success, secure enough to support her dreams, and brave enough to build a marriage based on who she really is, not who you thought she was. James nodded slowly. I'm not sure I know how to do that. Then learn. Get counseling, read books, talk to other couples who've navigated similar challenges. But don't let your insecurity kill the woman who's been protecting it all this time. They sat in silence again, but this time it was filled with possibility rather than confusion. James was beginning to understand that tomorrow's surgery wasn't just about saving Natasha's life. It was about deciding what kind of life they'd build together afterward. Michael, can I ask you one more thing? Of course. If she lives through this, if she becomes your business partner, will you take care of her? I mean, will you make sure she's valued and supported and given the recognition she deserves? Michael met his eyes. I'll make sure she's protected and respected as the brilliant strategist she is. But James, she doesn't need me to take care of her. She needs you to be strong enough to let her take care of herself. The distinction was important, James realized. Natasha didn't need another protector. She needed a partner who could match her strength, support her dreams, and love her for exactly who she was, not for who she'd been pretending to be to save his feelings. I think I'm ready to meet my wife, James said. The real one, not the version she created to make me feel better about myself. Are you sure? James thought about the woman lying in the hospital bed upstairs. The woman who'd built business empires in secret, who'd funded her own education with diner tips, who'd hidden a terminal illness to avoid burdening him, who'd protected his ego at the cost of her own dreams. I'm sure, he said. I just hope it's not too late to prove I deserve her. Morning came too early to room 314, arriving with the efficient bustle of pre-operative preparations. Nurses moved in and out with practiced precision, checking vital signs, reviewing surgical consent forms, and preparing Natasha for what could be either the beginning of her recovery or the end of her life. James had spent the night in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, dozing fitfully and waking every time a monitor beeped or a nurse entered. Michael had gone home around midnight but returned before dawn with coffee and the kind of determined expression that suggested he'd made important decisions during the few hours away. How are you feeling? Dr. Martinez asked Natasha as she reviewed the final pre-operative checklist. Scared, Natasha admitted. But ready, I think. Good. Fear is normal before major surgery. It means you understand the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Martinez looked at James and Michael. We'll be taking her up to surgery in about an hour. After that, it's typically a 6 to 8 hour procedure, followed by several hours in recovery. What are the risks? James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. With any cardiac surgery there are risks of complications. Bleeding, infection, issues with anesthesia. But Mrs. Wilson is young and despite her heart condition, she's in relatively good health otherwise. I'm optimistic about the outcome. After the doctor left, the three of them sat in the kind of charged silence that comes before life-changing moments. There were things that needed to be said, decisions that needed to be finalized, but no one seemed to know where to start. Natasha, Michael said finally, I need an answer about the surgical costs. The hospital needs payment authorization before they'll proceed. And I need an answer about what happens afterward, James added. Not about the business partnership but about us. About our marriage. Natasha looked between the two most important men in her life. One who'd unknowingly built an empire with her help, and one who'd unknowingly shared a bed with a stranger for 2 years. Michael, she said, if you pay for this surgery, I need you to understand that I will accept it as payment for work already completed. Not as charity, not as a gift, but as compensation I've earned. Michael nodded. That's exactly how I see it. And I want a formal contract afterward. If I'm going to be your business partner, I want everything in writing. Responsibilities, compensation, equity shares, everything. Done. James watched this exchange with something that might have been pride. Even facing surgery that could save or kill her, Natasha was negotiating like the business strategist she'd secretly become. James, she continued, turning to her husband, if I survive this surgery, if I take Michael's partnership offer, our life is going to change dramatically. I'm going to be traveling for business, attending corporate meetings, making decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars. James nodded, though he could see the anxiety in his eyes. I need to know that you can handle being married to that person. Not the woman who hid her success to protect your feelings, but the woman who owns her success and expects you to celebrate it with her. The question hung in the air like a challenge. James had spent the night thinking about this exact issue, but thinking about it and living it were different things. I don't know if I can, he said honestly. I don't know if my ego is strong enough, if I'm secure enough in myself to be the supportive husband of a business executive who earns 10 times what I make. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but Natasha smiled slightly. Thank you for being honest. But I want to learn how, James continued. I want to try. Because the alternative is losing you, and I finally understand what that would actually mean. What would it mean? It would mean losing the most intelligent, capable, selfless person I've ever known. It would mean spending the rest of my life knowing that I was too small, too insecure, too focused on my own feelings to appreciate the extraordinary woman I was married to. Natasha reached for his hand. James, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we rebuild our marriage after I become Michael's partner, you can't resent me when I have to work late, when I have to travel, when I'm tired from dealing with complex business problems. I know. And you can't use my success as a weapon against me when we fight. You can't throw it in my face that I earn more money or have more professional recognition. James winced, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of thing he might have done in the past. How do I make sure I don't do that? By building your own sense of worth that isn't dependent on being the primary breadwinner, Michael said quietly. By finding your own sources of pride and accomplishment. James looked at him. You sound like you speak from experience. My ex-wife was a surgeon. She saved lives for a living while I shuffled numbers around to make money. Guess which one of us felt inadequate? What happened? I couldn't handle being married to someone whose work was more important than mine. I started criticizing her hours, her dedication, her priorities. I made her choose between her career and our marriage. What did she choose? Her career. And she was right too. The admission hung between them like a warning. James could see his future in Michael's past. A man whose insecurity destroyed his marriage to an exceptional woman. How do I avoid making your mistakes? James asked. Therapy, Michael said bluntly. Individual counseling to work on your self-worth issues. Couples counseling to learn how to communicate about difficult topics. And practical changes. Develop your own interests, your own sources of fulfillment that don't depend on being the most successful person in your marriage. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Wilson, we're ready to take you up to surgery. The moment had arrived. All the discussions, negotiations, and emotional revelations had led to this. Natasha being wheeled into an operating room where her future would be decided by surgeons and machines and the resilience of her own damaged heart. Wait, James said suddenly. He stood up and leaned over Natasha's bed, looking directly into her eyes. Before you go, I need to tell you something. James? No, let me say this. For 2 years I've been planning to divorce a woman I thought I knew. Someone I thought had given up on life, on dreams, on building anything meaningful. I was wrong about everything. Natasha's eyes filled with tears. You're the most remarkable person I've ever met. You built a business empire while serving coffee. You funded your own education with tips. You hid a terminal illness to avoid burdening me. You protected my ego while sacrificing your own success. And you did it all with grace and humility and love. James, I'm not finished. His voice was fierce with emotion. If you survive this surgery, if you give me another chance, I promise I will spend every day learning how to be worthy of you. I will go to therapy, I will work on my insecurities, I will celebrate your success instead of feeling threatened by it. And if you can't? If it's too hard? James was quiet for a moment. Then I'll love you enough to let you go. But I'm going to fight to become the man you deserve. The man who should have been supporting your dreams all along instead of making you hide them. Natasha was crying now, but she was also smiling. That's all I ever wanted. Not for you to be small so I could feel important, but for you to be big enough that we could both be important together. The nurse cleared her throat gently. I'm sorry, but we really need to go. Michael stepped forward and took Natasha's other hand. Partner, he said simply. Partner, she agreed. James leaned down and kissed her forehead. I love you. All of you. The woman who serves coffee and the woman who builds empires. Fight to come back to me. Fight to become the man I come back to, she replied. As they wheeled her out of the room, James and Michael were left alone with the weight of promises made and futures hanging in the balance. 6 to 8 hours of surgery stretched ahead of them, time to worry, to hope, and to prepare for whatever came next. You meant what you said about therapy? Michael asked. Every word. Good. Because if she survives this, if she comes back to you, she's going to need a partner who can handle her success. Not someone who's threatened by it. James nodded, watching the elevator doors close behind the woman who'd been a stranger to him yesterday morning and was now the most important person in his world. Michael, can I ask you something? Sure. If she doesn't make it through the surgery, will you help me understand who she really was? Will you share the work she did, the impact she had? Michael's voice was quiet when he answered. She's going to make it through. She has to. The world needs what she's capable of building. But even as he said it, both men knew that surgery was surgery, hearts were fragile, and sometimes love and determination weren't enough to change medical outcomes. All they could do was wait, hope, and prepare for a future that could hold either heartbreak or the chance to build something beautiful from the ruins of what they'd almost lost. 18 months later, Natasha Wilson Thompson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, looking out over the city where her life had almost ended. The Thompson Industries headquarters buzzed with activity behind her, but she'd learned to find moments of quiet reflection even in the midst of corporate chaos. The surgery had been successful, though not without complications. 3 additional procedures, 8 weeks of recovery, and 6 months of cardiac rehabilitation had followed. But she'd survived, and more importantly, she'd thrived. Mrs. Thompson? Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. Your husband is here for lunch. Natasha smiled at the title she still wasn't quite used to. 3 months ago, she and James had remarried in a small ceremony attended by close friends, medical staff who'd become family, and business partners who'd become more than colleagues. It had been a very different wedding from their first one 20 years earlier, quieter, more thoughtful, built on truth instead of assumptions. James appeared in her office doorway, carrying takeout bags from their favorite restaurant. He'd changed jobs 6 months after her surgery, taking a position with a nonprofit organization that paid less but gave him the sense of purpose he'd been missing. The transition hadn't been easy, but therapy had helped him understand that his worth wasn't measured by his salary or his role as primary breadwinner. How was the Shanghai conference call? He asked, unpacking containers of food on the small table by her windows. Productive. We're finalizing the partnership with Lu Industries. The market expansion should generate about $400 million in revenue over the next 3 years. James still sometimes felt a small jolt when Natasha casually mentioned numbers that dwarfed anything he'd ever worked with, but the jolt was pride now instead of insecurity. That's amazing. How do you feel about the travel schedule? 2 weeks in Shanghai next month, then a week in London. But Michael's arranged for you to come with me to London if you can get the time off. James smiled. I already talked to my supervisor. She's excited about me doing some research on international nonprofit models while I'm there. This was how they worked now, as partners who supported each other's careers instead of competing with them. It had taken months of counseling, honest conversations, and deliberate practice, but they'd learned to build a marriage that could hold both of their ambitions. Michael knocked on the office door and entered with his own lunch. The 3 of them had developed a tradition of eating together when possible, a way of maintaining the connection that had saved all of their lives in different ways. How are the quarterly projections looking? Michael asked, settling into a chair across from them. Better than expected, Natasha replied, pulling up charts on her tablet. The Henderson partnership is exceeding projections by 12%. The European expansion is ahead of schedule. And the new consulting division is already booking clients for next year. The consulting division had been Natasha's idea, a way for Thompson Industries to offer the same strategic insights that had built Michael's empire to other companies. She'd been right about the demand for her services. They were now booked solid for 18 months with a waiting list of Fortune 500 companies. Speaking of the consulting division, Michael said, I had an interesting conversation with Rebecca Chen from Meridian Corporation yesterday. Natasha looked up from her tablet. The Rebecca Chen? CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country? That's the one. She wants to hire our consulting division for a major restructuring project. But she specifically asked for the strategist who worked on the Henderson deal. She wants me specifically? She said she's been following your work through industry connections. Apparently, you've developed quite a reputation in business circles. James watched his wife's face light up with professional pride, and felt nothing but happiness for her success. It had taken work to get to this point, individual therapy to address his insecurity, couples counseling to rebuild their communication, and practical changes to ensure they both had sources of fulfillment. But the effort had been worth it. What kind of timeline is she looking at? Natasha asked. 6-month project starting this fall. It would be your biggest independent consulting contract to date. Independent meaning? Meaning you'd be the lead consultant with full autonomy to structure the project and choose your team. It would establish you as more than just my business partner. It would confirm your reputation as one of the top strategic consultants in the industry. Natasha was quiet for a moment, and James could see her mind working through the implications. A year and a half ago, she'd been hiding her business acumen while serving coffee. Now she was being recruited by industry leaders who'd never even met her in person. "What do you think?" she asked James. The question itself showed how much their relationship had changed. Instead of making decisions in isolation to protect his feelings, she was including him in conversations about her career while trusting him to handle the reality of her success. "I think Rebecca Chin is smart to want to work with you," James said. "And I think you should take the contract if it interests you professionally. It would mean a lot of travel, long hours, high-pressure situations. And it would also mean you're doing work you love at the highest level possible. I want that for you." Michael watched this exchange with satisfaction. He'd seen too many talented people held back by partners who couldn't handle their success. Watching James and Natasha navigate this new dynamic gave him hope for his own future relationships. "There's one more thing," Michael said. Rebecca specifically mentioned wanting to discuss long-term consulting arrangements. Not just this project but ongoing strategic advisory services. "She wants to poach me from Thompson Industries?" Natasha asked with amusement. "She wants to hire Thompson Industries' consulting division for multiple projects over the next 5 years. We're talking about a potential $50 million contract." The number hung in the air for a moment. $50 million in consulting fees, generated by insights and strategies that had started with a woman working double shifts at a diner to pay for online business courses. "Natasha," James said quietly, "do you realize what you've accomplished?" She looked at him, then at Michael, then back out at the city where she'd collapsed on courthouse steps 18 months earlier. "I realize I almost missed all of this," she said. "I almost chose to die rather than complicate anyone else's life with my dreams." "And now?" Michael asked. "Now I understand that hiding your gifts doesn't protect the people you love. It deprives them of the chance to love you for who you really are." James reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry it took me so long to become someone worthy of knowing who you really are." "You were always worthy, James. You just needed to believe it yourself." Outside the windows, the city continued its daily rhythm of ambition and hope, failure and success, ordinary people discovering extraordinary capabilities within themselves. Somewhere out there, other couples were struggling with the same challenges James and Natasha had faced: how to love someone whose dreams were bigger than expected, how to support success instead of feeling threatened by it, how to build partnerships that could hold both people's ambitions. "I have a proposal," Natasha said suddenly. "A business proposal?" Michael asked. "A life proposal." She looked between the two men who'd helped save her in different ways. "What if we started a foundation? Something focused on helping people pursue education and career development regardless of their current circumstances." James understood immediately. "Like someone working at a diner who wants to take online business courses." "Exactly. People who have potential but not resources. People who are brilliant but trapped in circumstances that don't reflect their capabilities." Michael was already pulling out his phone to take notes. "What would you need to make something like that work?" "Funding for education, mentorship programs, maybe even business incubators for people who want to start consulting practices or small businesses." "How much funding are we talking about?" Natasha smiled. "Well, I do have a $50 million consulting contract to negotiate." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the possibility of transforming one woman's hidden struggle into opportunities for countless others. "You know what I love about this idea?" James said. "What?" "A year and a half ago, you were hiding your potential because you thought it would complicate other people's lives. Now you want to use your success to help other people stop hiding their potential. People shouldn't have to choose between pursuing their dreams and protecting other people's feelings," Natasha said. "And they shouldn't have to face life-threatening illnesses alone because they can't afford medical care. The foundation could include medical assistance for people with chronic conditions," Michael added. "We could partner with hospitals to provide treatment for people like you, brilliant individuals whose potential is being limited by health crises they can't afford to address." As they talked through the possibilities, developing plans for scholarships and mentorship programs and medical assistance funds, Natasha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A marriage that had nearly ended in divorce had been rebuilt on truth and mutual support. A secret career had evolved into industry recognition and million-dollar contracts. A life-threatening illness had become the catalyst for helping others facing similar challenges. "I need to ask you both something," she said as they finished lunch. "Anything," James replied. "Are you happy?" I mean really happy, not just relieved that I survived, but happy with how our lives have turned out. James considered the question seriously. A year and a half ago, he'd been planning to divorce a woman he thought lacked ambition. Now he was married to one of the most successful strategic consultants in the country, and he spent his days working for an organization that aligned with his values. The transition hadn't been easy, but the destination was better than anything he could have imagined. I'm happier than I've ever been, he said honestly. Not because you're successful, but because you're finally free to be yourself. And because I finally learned how to love you for who you actually are instead of who I thought you should be. Michael nodded. Building this company with you as a true partner has been the most rewarding professional experience of my life. And watching you two rebuild your marriage has given me hope for my own future relationships. Good, Natasha said. Because I have one more confession to make. Both men looked at her with mild alarm. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air for a moment before exploding into laughter, tears, and the kind of joy that comes from discovering life has more gifts to offer than you dared to hope for. How is that possible? James asked. I thought the heart medication. Dr. Martinez says everything looks healthy so far. The pregnancy is actually helping my heart function in some ways. Something about increased blood volume and circulation. When were you going to tell us? Michael asked, grinning. I just did. I wanted to make sure we had all the business arrangements settled first. I figure I can handle the Meridian contract during my first trimester, take some time off after the baby comes, and then gradually transition back to full-time consulting. James shook his head in amazement. Only you would plan to negotiate $50 million contracts while pregnant. Only me would have the support system to make it possible, Natasha corrected. As they sat in the afternoon sunlight, planning foundations and baby nurseries and business strategies that would impact thousands of lives, none of them dwelt on how close they'd come to losing everything. Instead, they focused on the future they were building together, a future where hidden gifts were celebrated instead of concealed, where marriages were partnerships of equals, and where success was measured not just in profits but in lives transformed. The woman who'd collapsed on courthouse steps 18 months earlier had become someone who built empires, but more importantly, she'd become someone who was loved and supported for exactly who she was. And that, all three of them agreed, was the most valuable transformation of all. Thank you for joining Natasha, James, and Michael on this emotional journey of love, secrets, and second chances. Their story reminds us that sometimes our greatest struggles can become our most powerful gifts, and that true love means supporting each other's dreams even when they're bigger than we expected. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever hidden your talents or dreams to protect someone else's feelings? How do you think couples should navigate situations where one partner's success significantly outpaces the other's? What would you have done in James's position when he discovered the truth about Natasha's secret career? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights help create a community where we can all learn from each other's experiences with love, ambition, and the courage to be authentically ourselves.